Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to say I associate myself with the impassioned Detroit tell it like it is comments of Representative Tlaib a moment ago, and completely disassociate myself with the comments offered by my colleague across the aisle. I find that I have that dual experience often on this committee of comparable pride of our honoring the words of our late chairman and being an efficient and effective pursuit of the truth, and simultaneous shame with all of the efforts to obstruct the work of this committee to get to the truth. But since there was a desire expressed earlier to center the science, I'd like to ask some line of questioning in line with that. It is reported that Johnson & Johnson's talc tested positive for asbestos as far back as 1957 and 1958. Yet, on more than one occasion, labs have tested samples from the same bottle of Johnson & Johnson's talc-based powder and come to different conclusions. As Representative Tlaib mentioned in her impassioned testimony or statement, Johnson & Johnson commissioned its own studies with samples from the same bottle and predictably announced their samples tested negative for asbestos. Notably, Johnson & Johnson's own commissioned lab also detected asbestos in one of the company's samples, yet later attributed the false positive to environmental contaminants of an air conditioning unit. Dr. Longo, how are divergent detection results possible when two samples from the same bottle are tested for asbestos?
If you have trace levels and you're using an unsensitive method, you can have where one sample will be detected and then another aliquot, you may not see that. So it's very hard to say, especially if you have a laboratory that did detect it, then didn't detect it. So you can't really compare apples to apples here.
Mr. Metcalf, geologically, how closely related are talc and asbestos?
Very closely related. As I said, many of the reactions that form talc, the metamorphic reactions that form talc, are breaking down amphibole and amphibole under the kinds of conditions that make them fibrous. And I'll say, I actually came to this not to look at talc, not because I was interested in talc, but because I was interested in understanding why amphiboles, which are sometimes fibrous and sometimes are not fibrous, why are they fibrous, what controls it? And as I started to do literature review, and there's a lot of papers published in the 70s and 80s and into the early 90s that looked at this with high resolution transmission electron microscopes, and I kept running into textures and understanding that we went from non-fibrous to fibrous amphibole to talc, and there was a reaction sequence that ended in talc. And that's what really got me interested, and I really wasn't paying attention to the talc stories and any of the stuff until I kept running into this in the literature. And so, yes, asbestos and talc are linked by geologic processes.
And so talc and asbestos evolved from the same protolith?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And so what environmental processes caused the protolith to evolve into asbestos and talc?
So the process that's involved in this most of the time, as I talked about, is something called hydrothermal alteration. It's a type of metamorphism. When a pre-existing rock, the protolith, is subjected to differing conditions of pressure and temperature, and particularly fluid flow. So over the course of the metamorphism, fluids are passing through the rock, and it's the reaction of those fluids with the protolith that drives these processes. All these minerals are hydrous minerals.
So during the rock evolution, asbestos can eventually become talc?
Right.
Okay.
Right,
So,
and what I'll add one thing is that again, I said this in my opening statement, we often talk about asbestos as being a contaminant in the talc, as though it fell out of a air conditioner, for instance, it's some foreign body that was introduced. But the reality is the way that talc forms, the road to talc leads through amphiboles and amphibole asbestos. And so it's a relic of the geologic process, not a contaminant from some foreign body.
okay, and so again, just to be clear, this will be my final question. So is it the case and accurate to say that talc can not reliably be asbestos-free?
Well, I wouldn't go quite that far. there are some, as I said, there are some reactions that have the potential, and it's been reported that they're asbestos-free versions. There's a mine in Montana. However, I don't think anybody's ever tested it to the sensitivity that Bill Longo has been discussing. So I think of the ones that people say are asbestos-free, I think that's not been demonstrated. I think the responsibility is to do the best testing possible and make sure that these things are asbestos-free. But I would be surprised if we could find any that's asbestos-free.
Thank you. I yield back.